I will be talking about the concept of life building, zhiznestroenie in Russian, and I think it's very relevant to the object we are discussing because there was an element of this life building creating a new type of social reality. And I want to start in 1925 at the Paris exhibition. That was after two revolutions, civil war, total destruction of the country, and swift recovery under the new economic policy. The Soviet government decided to participate in an international exhibition, despite the fact that France has not officially recognized the Soviet Union at that time. And Lev Kamenev, who was the chairman of the Council of Labor and Defense, explained, he said, we wanted to show the world that people who think that Russia is the wild place with wild men, they're completely wrong. So the official program said that the exhibition is open to all manufacturers whose product shows clearly modern tendencies. But if you look at this photograph, it's not really modern. It's rather eclectic with some elements of Art Nouveau and then the style that eventually became Art Deco. The name was taken from the name of the exhibition, of course. And there were only a few real modernist buildings, two by French architects, the Pavilion of Tourism by Robert Mallet-Stevens, and of course, Esprit Nouveau by Le Corbusier. And there was one by a Russian architect, Konstantin Melnikov, which was the kind of a celebrity at the show. Everybody loved his pavilions. He was truly modern, truly unique. Everything was built out of wood, by the way. And the most interesting thing that inside, as you heard already earlier, was the Workers' Club by Rodchenko, which was designed specifically for this exhibition. And what is Workers' Club? Sometimes people use the term social condenser. It's a very fashionable term, which is surprising because Ginsburg mentioned that maybe once or twice, and I think other than Ginsburg, I don't think anybody ever mentioned it at that time. But thanks to Anatole Kopp, who introduced this term in Europe, it became very fashionable. So we can use it, that's okay. So the Workers' Club, the idea is a reorganization of everyday life and creating a new type of a socialist worker. Rodchenko wasn't the only one who was involved. Melnikov himself, even though his pavilion had nothing to do with Workers' Club, he created quite a few clubs, as we all know. Here are just a few of them, but he actually created more. And what's interesting is that these are photographs by Rodchenko himself. He photographed, he was very happy when he realized that unfinished installation of the Workers' Club, Russian people who were immigrants from the Soviet Union were getting there despite the fact that it was blocked by a rope, and used it basically as a social condenser. They played games, they read books and magazines. So that was an interesting case where the idea really worked. Now, just briefly, a few words about the origins of the idea. Of course, it goes back to the 19th century, at least, in Russia. And usually people mention Nikolai Chernyshevsky and his novel, What is to be Done, which is the tale about the new people. And Chernyshevsky talked about the destruction of the family, of oppressive family, new type of relationship between men and women, free love, and some peculiar version of socialism based on basically peasant commune, the traditional Russian peasant commune. Then the idea, that was kind of a positivist version of life building, and then it went to, was picked up by symbolist Vyacheslav Ivanov, just opposed life creation to icon creation, so the artist should create life, not icons. Andrei Belый talked about merging art and new life. Vladimir Solovyov, very influential symbolist, was talking about free theurgy, and then it was picked up by Berdyaev, who was talking about anthropodicity, which is the same idea as theodicy, which is justification of God. Anthropodicy is justification of a human being who becomes a creator and becomes, in a sense, equal to God. And then finally, Nikolai Fyodorov, the famous author of Philosophy of Common Cause, where he has many ideas, but one of them, again, is the man, by creating, is emulating the divine creator. So the idea went very high into the sky, basically, and pretty much lost its practical meaning, which we saw in the idea of workers' club, where it was taking down from the earth. And here's an interesting example of life creating, life building in film. And in this photograph, we see Corbusier, Eisenstein, and Andrei Burov. It's interesting that in this photograph, Burov is wearing a leather coat that he recently bought from Le Corbusier. And it's an interesting fact because everybody knows that the Russian literature came out of Gogol's overcoat story, but here we can say that Russian architecture came out of Le Corbusier's leather coat. Anyway, in 1927, Burov, who was a constructivist at that time, he went through many incarnations as an architect, but at that time he was a constructivist. He was asked to design stage decorations for Eisenstein's film, The General Line, which was about collectivization of agriculture in the village. And Burov, as a true constructivist, suggested that he shouldn't create just decoration, he should create a real milk farm which would continue functioning in the village where the shooting took place. And this way, he wrote, cinema in general should show what is and what should be. And this formula, what should be, then later was repeated under socialist realism and during the Stalin epoch. The same expression meant completely different things, as we will see. Of course, the film was finished. It was Stalin asked that they change the name to the old and the new, and then in 1930 it was completely banned. So ideologically it was found wrong. In the meantime, the collectivization was a total disaster because by different estimates, a few million people perished during this forced collectivization. Was incredible level of famine in the country. And the decision to deal with this problem was also an interesting form of life building. The idea was to create an artificial abundance of food in a gated territory of Ostankino at the exhibition of agricultural exhibition, where the abundance of food was present inside the pavilions as real food, and it was reinforced by the sculptural and works. We can see those bulls and with murals and paintings and things like this. So that's where the idea of life building went, in a sense, it went back to this kind of sky level. But I wanted to talk about this film of 1940 by Grigory Alexandrov, already without Eisenstein. He created this film, The Shining Path. On some level, it could be considered a sequence to the general line. And it's basically a Soviet version of the Cinderella story. I just want to talk about one of the final frames. One of the final frames, the hero of the story, a simple woman from a provincial town, becomes a hero of labor. She gets a medal. She's invited. She meets Stalin, and she's a hero. And she delivers a very kind of a solemn speech at the agricultural exhibition. There is a sequence where she flies in the convertible car through the sky. The car lands at the exhibition, and she finally delivers her speech, which is rhymed, by the way. What's interesting is that the background represents the Palace of the Soviets, which, as we know, first of all, was never built. And the construction site, it was never finished. The construction site existed at that time, but it was many miles away from the agricultural exhibition. So the concept of what should be lost any practical application. It was, again, in some fairy tale kind of a manner as the whole film was. In 1939, the year when the agricultural exhibition finally opened, it took a while because of the purges and the replacement of all the management. It opened in New York. Again, the winner of the competition was Eafan, just like in 1937 in Paris. That was his building. And the interesting thing was inside the pavilion. Inside the pavilion was a huge model of the Palace of the Soviets. Behind it was, again, a huge mural painted by the team leading by Yuri Pimenov. Yuri Pimenov, you may know, is the author of this famous painting, New Moscow, where you see a woman driving a convertible car in Moscow. And there was an interesting memoir by a member of this team, Ekaterina Zernova. And she describes how the dialogue between artists and party leaders about what should be painted in the backdrop, and the theme was the city, Moscow of the future. And she says the Government Commission came and said the city of the future should look different. And when they asked how different, nobody could answer this question. So they used a lot of white paint, covered everything, painted a new city of Moscow of the future. The Government Commission came again and said, people are okay, but architecture is completely wrong. You should paint the buildings so they are lost in the haze and become barely distinguishable. And she says, it took many kilograms of white paint and a week of hard work, and finally, the Moscow of the future turned into just a cloud shining with light, but nothing really specific. So that's where the live building became completely creating an illusion. In 1939, there was another film made about the exhibition. It was an American film called The Middletown Family at the New York World's Fair. Very interesting film. You can see it on YouTube and other places. It's a full-length feature film with a professional director, professional actors, but it was financed by Westinghouse Electric. So, in a sense, it was an infomercial. It's the story of a typical American family from Midwest. They have a black maid and a very kind of sweet patriarchal relationship between the owners and the maid. And there is a girl who is maybe 18 or so, and she has two suitors. They want to marry her. One of them is Westinghouse sales representative, and he's a good guy. The other guy is a Russian art teacher. So he has two flaws. One is he's Russian, and number two, he teaches her abstract art, which at that time was a sign of an enemy. And of course, at the end, who gets the girl? Of course, it's the salesman. And here is the final frame where they look at the real exhibition inside the Westinghouse Pavilion. There are some electric sparks, some amazing show of technology, and the final dialogue, she says, "I wonder if the years ahead will be as bright as this." And he says, "We haven't seen anything yet, darling. This is merely a sample of the world of tomorrow." It's interesting to compare this ending frame with the ending frame of The Shining Path. First of all, there is nothing about technology. Look at the tools in the hands of those. This is a hammer and a sickle. It's not about technology. And which is interesting that Stalin's slogan, technology decides everything, of 1931, but by that time was replaced by his new slogan, cadre defines everything, or people define everything. So this is about people, nothing about technology. And what's interesting, the final sequence of movement, the camera moves in, we lose the actual characters, and we concentrate on their ideal representation, the statue, and then it keeps moving up, and film ends again in this shining cloud of the future. So the future becomes completely indistinguishable, shining, and absolutely nothing concrete. Now we fast forward a little bit, 1957. In 1957, Nikita Khrushchev was appearing on CBS, where he said there should be more contacts between our people, which was, it took Americans by surprise. In 1958, he and Eisenhower signed an agreement of exhibition exchange by 1959. The American exhibition opened in Moscow in 1959. And in order to kind of soften the blow of American technology on innocent Soviet people, they decided to kind of preempt it with our achievements. So the exhibition of agriculture was renamed Exhibition of Economic Achievements, and the pavilions, most of them were based on geography. It was like this one was the Volga region pavilion. They quickly redesigned it like this and called it radio electronics. And inside, they placed a working model of a color TV, because the rumor was that the Americans want to boast their colored television, which I think from 1953 they already had regular color TV broadcasting. But it was done in a haste. You can see those aluminum panels only covered the facade. If you look behind, you see the old Volga River Pavilion. So nobody bothered to, or they didn't have time to cover it completely. And all that was created to impress Richard Nixon, who you remember the famous kitchen debate between Nixon and Khrushchev, and this whole procedure of redecorating the pavilion and putting inside the working model of a color TV was to impress Nixon. Fortunately, Nixon wasn't impressed, and his secret telegram to Eisenhower said, "Nothing momentous." So all this was kind of wasted. Fast forward to perestroika. The new capitalism was completely devastating to this exhibition. By the way, the Muscovites never really bothered with changing the name Agriculture Exhibition of Achievements. Everybody knows it as just Выставка, which is exhibition. So if you just talk to a Russian where he lives near Выставка. Everybody knows what Выставка is. It's the exhibition. So this new capitalism was devastating to this glory that was created in the 50s. And then you can see the main pavilion, which was the most important. It was the pavilion of the Soviet Union, of the whole Soviet Union, unlike regional pavilions. Now you could buy weapons without license, the billboard says. And the pavilion of space exploration was converted into gardening tools. It was some kind of almost a swap meet where you can buy gardening tools, and you can see in the very back there is a little circle. It used to be Gagarin's photograph, and they tactfully covered it with a piece of white cloth. Now, in 2013, there was an idea that we have to restore the Stalinist grandeur, the glory. And in order to do this, the whole exhibition was given from the federal government to the Moscow government and its mayor, Sergei Sobyanin. You can see him in the middle here. And the first thing he did, you can tell, he took this white cloth from Gagarin's face. First of all, when Sobyanin made the speech, he says, we want to restore the exhibition of economic achievement to its previous glory. It was kind of an anachronism, because in 1954, it wasn't economic achievement, it was agricultural exhibition, but he didn't bother with all those minor details. So they started stripping the interior modernist layer, and sometimes discovered some real Stalinist beauty, like this relief by Vucetich. By the way, the composition is almost identical to this background we saw in the 1939 pavilion. And finally, Sobyanin said, get rid of this fake aluminum facade, let's restore the beauty behind it. Unfortunately, when they applied the fake facade, they cut all the sculptural relief in such a way that it was impossible to restore. So let's see quickly the sequence of events. In 1937, there was the first Volga River Pavilion that was almost immediately demolished. I couldn't find any photographs or any drawings, so we have a blank picture. In 1939, by the opening of the agriculture exhibition, they created this new Volga Pavilion on the same place with the sculptural figure of Chapayev on a horse with a saber. In 1954, when the agricultural exhibition was opened after a long after-war period when it was redesigned, the pavilion was demolished and a new one built with what under Khrushchev they called architectural excesses. And then finally, this is what happened in 1959 when it was redecorated. And finally, I want to show what it looks like today. It's a very kind of a pathetic state. First of all, you can still see in the back the Volga Pavilion. You can still see the frame to which the aluminum panels were attached. You can see some pieces of destroyed sculptural reliefs. So this photograph, this is the current state, shows that basically there is no idea what to do with all this. So it's in a typical way people were acting before thinking, which is unfortunately the current political reality when the television forces leaders to make quick statements and then think later. This is what happened there. And on this happy photograph, I would like to finish. Thank you.
In the wake of the Second World War, one may say that there was a big boom in building Soviet embassies abroad. More than 40 were built all the way through the collapse of the Soviet Union, beginning with around 1956, when the first embassy was built in Warsaw. It was built by Igor Rozhin, because he was building there the skyscraper in the same time. The skyscraper was the Soviet Empire style, so I won't show it to you. I was interested in just about everything. I conducted interviews with all those architects who have been involved in building embassies and could answer questions. In particular, I was interested in how the commission was given out. Building an embassy is quite a prestigious engagement in and of itself, and it gave the architects the possibility to travel, which in the Soviet Union was highly valued an opportunity. For example, when Rычagov was building the embassy in Cuba, only managed to get there once for one day, because he was engaged in Gostroy, he didn't have time for more. So the architects who were building embassies should also go through the procedure of receiving exit permits in the Soviet Union. For example, Yevsei Pershenkov, notwithstanding that his embassy was being built in one African country, I'll show you, never got the exit permit, never traveled anywhere, because his wife's relatives were living in Paris, therefore he was considered unreliable. The commission was placed sometimes pretty randomly. Not randomly, but various institutions were involved. The Foreign Ministry didn't have its own design bureau. So Hyper Theater, who was building theaters, designed some embassies also. And Perchenkov, for example, he was designing athletic arenas or spas. Nevertheless, he also got commissioned to build an embassy. Sometimes there were closed competitions within the design bureaus, or other times it was just done through a talk in the elevator. For example, Felix Novikov writes that
Сейчас я процитирую.
and it's a quote. Hold
То есть
on.
как буквально распределялся заказ.
How literally those commissions were placed. I don't remember why I went to the deputy director of MOS project, Tub Sokolsky. When we exhausted the conversation, he told me we have a commission to build an embassy in Mauritania. What do you want to say? I asked. What I wanted to say, I already said, he responded. The same day, I encountered the chief engineer of the institute, and I told him I have an interest in this embassy. He just smiled back. So apparently the question was resolved not without the participation of Postolkin. So the next day the head of the studio asked me to come over to get the instructions for this work. He gave me a folder with the documents and told me, let's do it together. The country is small, it will be too narrow for both of us, I don't have the time. So without any competition, some of the commission for embassies were placed like this. I was interested how they technically built those embassies. The design was done here in the Soviet Union. What followed? Well, the design was done in Moscow. The architects not always had the possibility to travel to the site, to look at the climate, the site, or get an idea of what it's all about. Everything was built by the locals, local contractors. So what I'm showing you right now shows you a girl with a spade, a local. For example, Yuri Konovalov told me that when they were building his embassy in Ethiopia, the girls just carried bricks on their heads, as is customary in Africa. He was immensely impressed by that. The buildings were built. This is an embassy in London. It's not the Soviet embassy. This is Gropius built in Athens, other countries. Let's move on to the Soviet embassies. This is the embassy in Stockholm, Sweden, built by Anatoly Polyansky in 1958. It took a while to build. It was finished only in 1972, but the exterior is almost in full harmony with the design that I'm showing you. And it's pretty remarkable because we're talking 1958, the World Expo in Brussels, where Polanski, then still very young, he was only 30, he submitted the Soviet pavilion to the Brussels Expo. It was called the Glass Parthenon. I think everyone remembers that, that's why I'll skip the photo of that. The Soviet pavilion, notwithstanding that the Soviet press reported it was embraced with great delight, the Western press nicknamed it the Glass Parthenon. And it was somewhat conservative, although it was aluminum and glass. It seems to me, in that embassy in Stockholm, it was designed the same year. Polyansky pretty freely treats modernist forms for 1958. This is pretty contemporary a building. What impressed me in this embassy is the interior. Since the information on embassy is closed, I do not know whether this was implemented fully, but I think this is interesting to see this modernist big glass curtains and zigzag lamps with the small columns that are painted to resemble Russian birches. This seems to me somewhat of an architectural kitsch. Subsequently, we'll see that that was a proliferant pattern. If you see on the background, there is Kremlin, because Kremlin is the epitome of the world, as we know. This is the movie theater interior without kitsch. Contemporary sculptures wooden paneled ceiling, glass curtains, which should of course have been shut down during movie screenings. I don't know whether it was implemented or not. When he got the first when the architects got first commissions for embassies, they had pretty high chances of getting another one. Many major architects designed several embassies each. For example, Polanski, who we're now watching, made 3 embassies. Posokhin made 2, one in Washington, the other in Brasilia. Polyakov made 2 in Africa. And Yuri Konovalov, somewhat less known, also made 2 embassies. It was very important to get the first commission, then there was a chance to get more. This is the embassy of the Soviet Union in Egypt, which Polanski made somewhat later. Structurally, it's replicating his Swiss embassy. This is a scaled model of the Swiss embassy. It's a larger volume, 5-story, built into a 2-story. The 2-story is, this is the Egypt one, it's the administrative and representative spaces, and in the 5-story, it's the working offices and residences. The working offices are broken down by this vertical rhythm. You can get how many stories are there, what's transpiring there. This is some imperial shut, closed attitude. And then on the inside, you have the apartments, and then the rhythm is more corpuscular, and they're looking backwards. This is just for fun, one of the offices in the embassy. After that, he did the embassy in Greece, also in his own style, more flat, representative reception hall and movie theater, and the higher volume is the working offices, and the residences are in the background. You see in that additional wing in the top right corner. This is the already built embassy. The pictures are taken by Polanski himself, and you still see Lenin's head, which is present in every embassy building as an irreplaceable attribute. There's also the frieze here, which is called the Russian legend. I would like to draw your attention. It seems to me important that in all of these embassies there are some historical references. On the outside they're completely modernist, but the interior always has something that refers to Russian history. This is the furniture of the representative part, which the high VIP visitors could see, and this is the interiors, less modernistic, more comfortable, presumably. There is a fireplace. This is the apartment of the residence of the ambassador of the time. This is the embassy in Paris by Pokrovsky. There was this story. Initially, he was not off limits. He could travel, he oversaw the construction, then he had a skirmish with the police officer in a restaurant, so that was reported, he no longer was permitted to travel. This is the late 70s, and I would like to draw your attention to the architecture. If we compare this with the Polanski embassy in Stockholm, this is a much heavier structure. I would say it looks like more like a district party office without any national features, completely airtight, but it has a courtyard which is more chamber style. These are his sketches. I think they're interesting to watch. We discovered these in the MFA archives, fully practically coinciding with the implemented building. This is the courtyard, which he was praised for a lot. And this is the interior. The interior is in absolutely palatial style if we compare with late 50s, early 60s. It's more pathetic and refers us back to imperial bulls of 19th century, which reminded me of the opening ceremony of the Sochi Olympics, where they showed the entire ancient Russia history all the way through the avant-garde. There is no avant-garde here. All interiors of embassies are always referring to Russian history. Kremlin is a must, and various periods are highlighted. That was the sketch. This was the real photograph. Unfortunately, you don't see it very well. This is the design in the rustic style of some dining hall. It wasn't built because that's the real photo of the same space. It seems strange, but there is almost an identical Polakov design to that of Posokhin of Ethiopian embassy in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa. Maybe they've seen each other's work. This is Rychagov's embassy in Cuba, very well-known structure. I talked with his daughter, Anna. She had taken part, like his wife did, in painting the frescoes in interior, so they were aware of the construction. The initial scaled model is not very similar to the final building, because in his own memoirs, Rychagov tells us that, well, you remember that Cuba in the wake of the Caribbean crisis was the bulwark of the Soviet Union. At the back door of the US. So you see how the tower shape changed over time. Rychagov had to modify it because they wanted to place certain special service contraptions there. He had to make it thicker. He wasn't very happy with that, but he still claimed that this was a Russian monastery with a high watchtower in the backyard of the Western capitalist world. Pretty brutal structure. I don't think it resembles a monastery. It simply is done in a brutal style. These are the interiors. It seems to me that it's striking how he combined extremely contemporary highlights and forms with the à la Russe. There is a particle of the motherland à la Russe. These are various options of how his wife and daughter were painting the murals, and it was all implemented in shades of blue. This is how it looks, and the working offices are completely modernist. This is to cater to your what's for work. It has to be strict, official. Whatever is to cater to your soul is done in a more freestyle. There is Vladimir Ilyich. We get back to 1962. This is the Soviet embassy in Morocco. This was never built. Makarevich design. He then came up with another one. This is a completely light international style of architecture in the styles of the 60s. Where do I take all of this? The embassy architecture fully replicates that which transpired in the architecture of the Soviet Union. Early 60s are all like this, light, international, and the interiors are similar. No hint of this being either Morocco or the Soviet Union. Everything is completely international in style. As a result, this was built in Morocco. This was designed by Makarevich, but he let go of the first design, and in the 70s, they built the embassy like this. This is a photograph that was published back then. And the critics, this embassy is one of the few which, the photo of which was published in the media. This was praised a lot, claiming that it combines local architectural features as well, which I think is significant, because in none of this is only possible in Asian and African embassies. None of the European embassies has any reference to the local architecture. No way. This is the USSR embassy in Gabon by Krasilnikov in the 80s. I talked to him about this, and he told me that if you look at it under certain angles, these arcs should allude to Muslim architecture, because Gabon is a Muslim country. So the Soviet representation there should demonstrate the presence of the USSR, and it should camouflage under local architecture. But the murals are in the same style. You cannot avoid, there's no avoiding Kremlin, that's arc important. When Krasilnikov was telling me about this embassy, he told me that he had instructions to have the mandatory set in the interior of certain motifs, and this is the only case where it was allowed to let go of the Red Square was the embassy in Spain, which was designed by Ilya Glazunov, a painter, and they allowed him to paint the palace square in St. Petersburg upon special permission. This is the embassy by Novikov in Mauritania with local motifs. And this is the embassy of the USSR in Ethiopia by Konovalov, where they used local motifs both in the interior, but not of the building of the embassy, not the chancellery, but the club, the building of the club of the embassy. He told that he was allowed to travel there, and he leaned on local architectural environment. This is all of my slides, but I want to add that the Soviet embassies should have been, incidentally, for this embassy, they brought a Lenin sculpture from Moscow, and Konovalov told us that the podium, it was a bronze bust on a marble pedestal, and the pilots refused to take it on board because it skewed the load distribution on a plane, risking disaster. They were still made to bring this bust. The pilots airlifted. I want to draw your attention to the following, that the architecture of Soviet embassies should have been representative of the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union was not only Russia, and Russia was not Moscow. So it seems to me it's essential that no motifs of the Soviet republics were ever present in the exterior or interior. Everywhere it's just Moscow, and only in one case there is St. Petersburg on the murals. So the Soviet representatives abroad were always representing exclusively Moscow. And that was an instruction that came from top to bottom. I guessed that much, but the answer was unambiguous. Thank you. My communication is pretty long, so I will read through it fast, hoping that the interpretation will catch up, since I handed over the text. Well, he didn't actually, whatever. The name of the title may seem careless if a person studied Central Asian architecture. Well, mostly we're talking Central Asia. After I come up with the main idea on Central Asian examples, I would still like to reflect on Armenia, because I feel that whatever transpired here was completely different from what transpired in Central Asia. The Central Asian lens allows to see new things in here. The Armenian colleagues may have a legitimate question. Armenian architecture is incontestably different from all others, and Central Asian ones are different. Why focus communication on the differences, which is taken for granted anyway? Here's my answer. The unique nature of each republic, which was clearly visible in the context, didn't look like that from the center of the Union, which dominated in the Union. It was in full compliance with the ideology, and it was supported by the major institutions. Caucasus and Central Asia were identified as part of the Soviet East. and they were looked at in the context of the Orientalist discourse. This was visible in mass culture. Soviet people could emphasize their understanding of Central Asian and Caucasian specifics, telling that the East Orient is a fine issue, accentuated by the Caucasian hostage and Mimino. There was this trend to merge in the same heap Central Asians and Caucasians. The same pertained to high culture. Notwithstanding the post-colonial attitudes in the downtown Moscow, to this day there is a museum of the peoples of the East. Last month it still had an exhibition, The Art of Central Asia and Caucasus, with explanation on rationale why do these two exhibit together. Because the dialogue East-West took place through the Russian culture. Russia here is the envoy of the West, which comes in touch with the Caucasus and Central Asian East.
I think now it is clear what unites the people in this room with Alexander Volkov. The theorists sometimes cover the Caucasus and Middle Asia. That's, of course, the classicists of the 20th century on one side. And I'm going to turn back to the texts yet, as well as the leaders of the Thaw, as well as Grigory Revzin, who united some of the rooms in some of the pavilions in Veda and Khak also, and among the last we have Armenia, Georgia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. Well, it's still okay, but the attitudes in the core impacted the overall situation in the whole country. And then after the collapse, this genealogy of the modern architecture is conceived as a serious attitude and direction. According to one of the widespread perceptions of Soviet architecture and its contents of 1922-80s, essentially there are two main categories. It's a little bit embarrassing to read through these phrases, but still I'll do that. So they were named differently. On one side we had the avant-garde modernism culture, the primary culture of the first, and then Stalinistic approaches, culture number two, etc. So the secondary culture per se. So the categories were essentially the same. In first case we would mean constructivism, rationalism, functionalism, and the second is just stylish approaches that have inherited from all the different eras. Remenskakov call it the culture of one and a half, but the essence is different, and that's not the important thing. At the same time, the avant-gardism and the modernism essentially started moving towards cosmopolitanism and universality in the approaches. Well, this stylistic approaches brought also the national perceptions of the peoples of the world, and that conflict arose yet in the beginning of the 30s, when after the first decade of the existence of Soviet Union, the approaches were kind of trying to reform the revolutionary perception of the situation into something different. So these cliches in the names of my report might be somehow compared to the avant-gardism and modernism to a certain extent. That's why there needs specification. At least the imperative of creating national architecture was characteristic for the whole Soviet territory, and in this situation the constructivism did not differ a lot from Stalinism. I would like to focus more on the simple comparison of universal modernism and the historical traditional styles, and in the modernistic search for a third route that could be locally approximated. It says the Middle Asia, the third route was confined, was hidden in conflict with the overall idea of national architecture. It was perceived as a search for contemporary architecture or local contemporary architecture per se, in order to... And in Armenia, by the way, the third route, the third way, was a part of the national architecture. It was perceived as a search, exactly, for the national contemporary architecture, whereas in Middle Asia, it was a search between the remonstration to that idea. So in order to demonstrate the differences respectively, I had to first of all show the subtle, articulated tensions that might have occurred and then in this area, and then only turn to Armenia. However, before I go there, I might make some conceptual remarks. First, everyone knows the attraction of presenting cosmopolitan architecture of the 20th in the globalistic Soviet ideas with the overall purpose of merger of the nation into one state. Well, the alternative to this vision occurs only in post-colonial studies. That might have occurred. Specifically, I remind the text from the Journal of Imperia that had compared most of the accents. In their opinion, the real revolution occurred in the later imperial era of Russia, which was epistemological, and yet before 1917 that revolution resulted in elaboration of a language that described the hybridity, the mixture, the merger of the nations, as it was cited by the authors themselves. In later periods, the conceptual hybrid of this social stance per se would reflect upon the approaches of that time, reaching the most radical approaches of the socialistic ideals. The result of this imperial revolution was the counter-revolution, essentially, that brought back the creative process towards the structural flow of every country. In the first half of the 20th century, in the Central Asia specifically, there were essentialistic perceptions and tractates of the nation per se, and the merger as such, as well as the counter-revolutionary approaches that would bring the language and traditional thinking to some ideas of the Middle Ages. Even in this time, exactly in this time, that the title nations idea came upon, that was more conducively relating to national minorities on the territories that would live, referring to Trim Martin at this moment. So instead of this soldering, there was a general route of political development in Central Asian republics and establishment of a nation with all the Marxistic properties, general or common language, territory, and traditions and culture, etc., respectively, between the modernism with its purposes on clarity and the political reality that requires establishment of national or traditional cultures. There is a big gap which had to be filled with some narratives and establishment of national modernistic architectures correspondingly. In this situation, in this regard, the situation in Armenia and in the Central Asian countries differed significantly. So, if we discuss the art per se, the Central Asia, starting from the Soviet period, had the distinguishment among A and B type of artists, national and non-national, correspondingly. In the first place, we had the majority ethnographic groups representatives and the others non-Asian origin representatives or minority representatives. They were not very difficult and different, but their roles and functionalities differed from one another significantly. According to the conventions that occurred in that time, direct expression of national culture could be done only by the ethnical representatives of the Asian nations and none those who had different origin, for example, or belonged to a different ethnic group correspondingly. They could show the everyday life. Mikhail Kuzin, for example, would have reflected on that as follows. Uzbeks must have their own art and fine arts, whereas the Russian artists have to help them with that. Or Ovanes Tatmasyan, who was the founder of Samarkand factory, reported about his work conducted to one of the Moscow journals, verbatim saying the following: there is specific attention paid to hiring people from the locals, respectively contributing to the traditional perception of the culture in this country. Respectively, the establishment was intermediated with some auxiliary approaches, some of them preparing these people in one way, the others reflecting the national art correspondingly. Also, the conventionality regarding the East was considered, because the national artist status per se was absorbed better by those who were originally related to East. So, the works of Dantsepayeva compared to those of Karakhan, for example, and here are the descriptions. Urala Dantsepayeva in Uzbekistan was not only a national artist at the time, but also headed the Association of Uzbek Artists at the time. So, whereas Nikolai Georgievich Karahan's Armenian artist born in Karabakh in characteristics, I mean, in qualifying him, they would say he's ambivalent. I mean, half Persian, for example, such type of words they would use to characterize him, bringing him closer to the context. And there is this interesting phenomenon here that an artist, Armenian, is essentially represented as half national. And then, if we take this path in the discourse, then we will see that this division between West and East was quite clear, because people who applied that distinguishment understood it very well, perceived it very well. But the same Armenian artists of the time, they were represented not as Western, but as Eastern as well as those from Central Asia. And there is another citation putting civilizational barriers between Martyros Saryan and Pavel Kuznetsov, for example. I'm trying to show the work to kind of prove that they're working approximately in the same direction, but the description in the Russian Academy of Fine Arts says the following. In Russian, we see Saryan as well as closer to those warmer colors of blue and red correspondingly, and the other one is just showing the life of the Kyrgyz and Uzbek nations in the prairies, whereas Kuznetsov was a Russian who came to the East. He was not from that area of the world, and he just simply expressed himself, or kind of the impressions that he had about that part. Saryan was different. He was a part of the East. He had the national art and cultural perception and stable basis on which he could have created his works. We should not be thinking that in architecture everything was different. No, the stereotypes were enrooted in the establishment of an architectural language. That's why they were reflected in all the lives of the professional communities in all the countries. If the primary first artist would appear in the end of the 20th century in Central Asia after years of education in people's schools, so-called, or in workshops, then for the training of the first wave of architects whose creation or generation would have required the presence of universities could have lasted decades, respectively. There was a lot of intensity among these relations in the beginning and the mid of the 20th century, and that is why in all the Central Asian republics before the war and the first decade after the war, national architecture was not created by national architects. They have such people who had never visited Central Asia but were trying to become national architects of the time for that specific country of the region, representing certain interests and approaches, like, for example, embassies in African countries. Those who were here in short touristic or professional tours, business tours, those who arrived here to live in this region, and those who were born in this part of the world, and those who got education in the capitals of those countries because they could not have the intention of expressing fully the national cultural perception and the idea. They were simply leading the process, kind of coordinating, trying to create these reproducible shapes and ideas of the future languages. The architecture would simply reflect upon those forms that were established in Islamic understanding of architecture primarily, so by the renowned professionals of constructivism and nationalism. First example, Melnikov. Quite original in famous forms, plus the ornament revisited with some local patterns added to it. At the same time, Magomedov would characterize the principles of Melnikov as follows. His talent is related to distortion of the decoration. He would approve only such type of art in architecture in which an author creates something that belongs only to himself and no one else before or after him correspondingly. That turns out that out of something that might not be considered possible in a certain area, we shift towards the East, and Orientalism and such a discourse was stronger than the modernistic principles were. Second part is the Soviet building, Soviet core, let's say, and some decoration in Islamic manner. So the same here. In Stalin's time already, first designed the theater with arches, circulars, templons, and then they remembered the national traditional thing, and now the arches are a little bit stretched and the decorations have changed. And then We had the era of the so-called made in Moscow national style, because Moscow architects, when designing the leading structural approaches in Tashkent, for example, essentially predefined the future for that sector of activity. And there are a number of examples over here to make this faster. So this is the Palace of the Friendship of Nations. Kaczynski from Moscow came to Tashkent for quite a long time compared to his colleagues, and created this quintessential national style. So when Moscow architects dictated some of the stereotypes and local architects, Kazakhs or Kyrgyzs, started to work in this direction, they essentially designed in the same framework, in the same shape, as if presenting the national forms in modernistic concepts. Well, essentially my presentation is not devoted to that trend. I'm more interested in the alternatives to that approach. That's why I'm coming back to the beginning. And the beginning, of course, was 1925, when Stalin pronounced that slogan of cultural reform. So before the students of the Communistic University of the Laborists of East, the architects immediately responded with the article of Ginsburg of the Nations of the USSR, Culture of the Nations of USSR, immediately taking over the work to be done, respectively. Central Asia was considered as the dead East, or like a tomb of the Islamic perception, with the lively East, so-called, or living East, that had to be reflect the overall good mood or positiveness everywhere in the streets and in the buildings and decorations, etc. So especially when talking about this, I would pay attention to its orientalistic prerequisites. And looking at the mosques, I thought that I should take the mission of thinking which East should be considered dead and which is the one that should be considered alive. So of course that persisted in the text of the Soviet nations at the time, but there are a number of worthy moments over here we should pay attention to. Is that the cultural unit of East is the city, the accumulated energy of every city that might contain the potential of remonstration in distinguishment of different multicultural delicacies and elements of Central Asia with some ethnical components and hierarchy of national understandings, whereas the city is an inclusive formation and its unique appearance is generated because of the presence of diversity of cultural perceptions. Of course, Ginsburg could not go against that, but the overall idea of creating this modernistic shape, focusing on the city in general, not only parts of it, would then persist in Central Asia throughout the whole Soviet period. Apparently, I'll skip the analysis of Ginsburg's and Leonidov's works in order to show how exactly this process was implemented, the process of designing a city which is universal for the whole nation, not only for the dominating group. Terechov was a small colonial city made by Russian colonists, and I'm not even going to read through it, I'll just tell you. So, at the time, there was this goal to quickly reach new borders, reach India and China, because there was the feeling that some things could happen there, some revolutions could happen in that part of the world, and Terechov would essentially play a dubious role. On one side, it was a city, it was a town that had to be the road towards India and China, with a railroad to be constructed over there, and respectively contribute to the revolutions taking place. On the other side, it could be a kind of a stand of socialism in the East, which had to demonstrate how would communistic societies be formed in the eastern countries and based upon the experiences of Central Asia. So interestingly, just exactly as it would happen in Morocco, later the main errand was to build residential space for autochthones and for Europeans and Russians, labor workers and former nomads. The main purpose was to bring the nomads to a more sedentary way of life, form of existence, to demonstrate all those socialistic approaches and have the nomadic approaches eliminated, so that the sedentary form of life is clearly understandable and it differs from nomadic way of life. So essentially, the livelihood had to change. Respectively, the apartments or the residential buildings that were built for nomads, former nomads, were completely different compared to the other groups of the population. They contained completely different solutions architecturally, the solutions related to collective existence. They had to be taken away from that tribal approaches to life, and that's why they started building separate apartments for them, like cells. Whereas for the workers from Russia, it was much more socialized. There were not just separate apartments for a family, but there were like common kitchens, common areas where the kids could play, and some separate rooms where people would just spend their time in the day. So that is why it was supposed that at the time when autochthones would become more socialized, reach a higher level of development in terms of socialization, they would kind of gain the right to get the apartments that were built for the Russian workers. And the latter was considered to be a higher level of socialization. The ones that were built for Russian workers were considered to be kind of more developed thing, rather than those separate apartments that were built for nomads. So that is why the residential space was divided, rearranged afterwards, after the nomads got accustomed to a different way of livelihood. Another thing here, just the same way as CT brings together people belonging to different ethnic groups, the same way there is certain climate that dominates in a settlement, in a town, and that impacts both the Russian workers and the former nomads. Respectively, the designs considered a lot of various machinery, tools on how to deal with a sand-made wall or sand houses. And this is where the traditional nomadic settlements played their role. The water supply thing was very important as well. I mean, every such cell was connected to a main for supply of water, and that, of course, united not the national ethnic groups, but just different ones, which was of principal importance of the time. Another important thing is that the autochthones got these round-shaped houses, so that the nomads who lived in Kluns before would feel themselves more comfortable in this new type of a building and then turn towards the more sedentary way of life, because that's a style Vladimir would mention in the first lecture of the Biennale, that was materially expressed in these designs, because they were expected to build new livelihood for that ethnic group by at the same time bringing it close to their architectural national perception, so that it's comfortable for them. So it's different for Russians, different for the nomads, and third for the architects, engineers who would arrive in the place in order to do all that. A different example now, bringing my narrative towards closer to the 60s now, when in Tashkent and Ashgabat they built these two buildings that became like temples, urban temples without any religious connotation. On one side it was the Palace of Arts, with no references to national architecture, more an international style with quite delicate approach in urban space, because the building had two different blocks, one transparent, translucent, kind of towards more European contextual reality, and the other in round-shaped, with columns, looking at the old city, and observed really marvelously with this Uzbek architecture, to a certain extent kind of being the continuation thereof, but just columns with templons. So these two types of temples, the art complex and the palace and the Marx Library in Ashgabat, were just common areas for the people that would come there from the old city and the new city. So it would turn out that these two completely iconic structures would unite without any exception, and there were no references to a national architecture or religion therein. Why is this important? Because architects, and Satyagin and Akhmedov, they would bring that all to everything which was in association with national architecture, and they would publicly state it. I will bring just an excerpt to your attention, verbatim. A person entered the chief architect's office from Moscow Stroy construction company that was designing a botanical garden in Moscow. They talked to one another, and it turned out they needed to build a building. And then the person coming down and whispering in the ear of the architect says, "We will make it in a national style." When he left, I started laughing, and Ahmed looked really very murky, because he became very serious. He did not understand what the joke was about. So what to do? To explain to him what is a programmatic approach, lack of any falsification or full sovereignty in making decisions. These are very hard things for him to understand. Respectively, everything paradoxical immediately reflects upon the situation. It is obvious that Ahmed would negatively react upon the attempts to force him or to dictate, for example, Stalinistic Vedin type architecture to him. By the way, Akhmetov was viciously against bringing Moscow architects to construction in Ashgabat. There is another quite demonstrative part, an excerpt from his text. I'm not going to read it through because we don't have the time. However, he was really the fighter of localized architecture. He would say the architect should feel the city, should be a part of it, and only then he might contribute to it with his ideas in architecture. However, as I expressed in this episode, Akhmetov, he just remained silent, and that silence might be explained by the absence of any alternative. Moreover, after the construction of Ashgabat Library and Arts Palace in Tashkent, the representatives of the Moscow capital media that would generate quite high-quality articles about the work of Akhmetov found nothing better but just saying that it is traditionally, historically justified. Maybe Karen. Indeed, they used this metaphysical word most of the times, which I do not accept as any metaphysics at all, because it seems to me that metaphysics justifies only mythological phenomena in construction. So, in a nutshell, according to all those explanations that were offered to the capital media, The modernists in Central Asia had deeper approach compared to the Orientalists in Moscow. So to suppose that national is not adequate category for this kind of structures would not be wise. And maybe there is a different flexible term that might fit those in Moscow with their approaches, but not completely anyway. So now, when ambivalent attitude to the architecture of Central Asia might sound maybe sporadic, but at the same time some constructiveness may be attributed, I will turn to Armenia with its national forms, if I can put it this way. I'll skip this. And this. Okay, this is longer than necessary, but still. I would tell you about 4 specificities. Central Asia was expressed latently. In Armenia, it was articulate and obvious. After Stalin said that national culture thing, Arshakter Vahanyan expressed himself towards the nationalistic approaches in culture, and well, he was Trotskyist more than Stalinist, respectively. He decided to put aside that perception that it was nationalistic. Tervaganyan was a multifaceted author, and he would perfectly perceive all those socialistic methods and what they wanted, and they perfectly understood the history and had a very interesting investigation about the work of Khachatur Abovyan, who was the creator of modern contemporary Armenian language, whereas the purposefulness of Vahanyan would say that he did not only criticize the nationalistic style, but he would clearly demonstrate the colonial character thereof, especially when describing the train station in Baku. He would say that Moscow specialists who did not want to build such a station, for example, in Moscow, would receive appraisal because of what they built in Baku. Vahanyan mentioned that these people still have this condescending approach towards the republics, and they still consider Baku as an exotic Baghdad. Second thing, Armenian architects would always remain the parts of the process inside the country, respectively. There were no tensions among themselves here in regard to national architecture and non-national architecture among those who are designing and those who are implementing. At the same time, the modernism would be expressed in a more conflicting situation in Armenia, in the country of modernism that would take itself away from any historical connotations of vernacular construction materials, would essentially become the most understandable symbol of national principles and values. The context supposed that any modernistic form, even if it is abstract, is an expression of national culture because it was created by an Armenian architect. That was the solution. In Central Asia, such freedoms were not allowed. They were allowed for just several years during Khrushchev, when the slogans like nation and culture were left as secondary. Third, having several identities and having the ability of moving among different contexts in culture, Armenian architects impacted not only the agendas in Armenia, but also in the center, in Moscow. Very well visible that was demonstrated by Alexander Tamanyan and Karl Alabyan, and the latter, by the way, together with Georg Kochar and Mazmanyan, who were the heroes of our previous presentations, became the founders of an architectural association that played a key role in an attempt to make the searches for orthodox constructivism more tangible, and functionalism as well. When speaking of that, it is worth underlining that the association's history is still quite obscure. Before the perestroika, it was lost somewhere in some groups. After 1990, it became a category that was not well understandable because some constructivism, like Leonid, for example, came up leading that process, saying that some changes might still occur, and then it all collapsed, etc. So, at the same time, quite an attentive look with a magnifying glass maybe could have distinguished between those ideas of industrialisms that occurred in those times and the separate developments of the local forms of modernism depending on the psychology of locals, especially referring to the report of Mikhail Mazmanyan read in 1929 in Communistic Academy when he was discussing the similarities between the clergy and residential settlements, apartments, or differences or similarities in climate or cultural perceptions among Armenians who lived in one part of the country and another part of the country. Of the world, I'm sorry, not the country. So, and the fourth, the members of this association, through their leverage, influenced not only Armenian decisions, but processes taking place in Central Asia. For example, in the designs for the settlements for highland nomads, 1933, by the way, they clearly had influence, and the cherished houses were created together with Kalmykov. Kalmykov was at the time one of the decision makers in the process, and then was a member of the Association of Urbanistic Architecture. Essentially, he absorbed the ideas that were born in a different group of architects in a completely different part of the world. So I think that these pictures clearly witness their internal connection. So this is a whole list, if I can say so, of horizontal ribbons. I could have considered this, but the time is up, and I hope that I at least partially presented the theme. Thank you.